Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Dan and welcome back for yet another episode. In today's episode, it's an interesting one for me because we are comparing the Canon R3 and the Canon R5 Mark II, the newly released Canon R5 Mark II. These two cameras couldn't have been more different in terms of the overall body, but the R3 is a workhorse, yes, the battery life is impressive, it has a built-in grip, the video aspects, the image taking capabilities, but the R5 is so small and has a lot of those same capabilities and even more resolution to work with, plus a little newer autofocus algorithm and C-Log 2. And I have to say I really do like the R5 Mark II that is. Let's start with the heart of these two cameras. The R3 supports a 24 megapixel full frame stacked BSI sensor, which is truly amazing. It has one of the fastest reading speeds out of any camera, except for global shutter cameras, but it does not suffer from any rolling shutter issues or bending, and the dynamic range is one of the best I've ever tried, and ISO capabilities are a breeze. So the R3 sensor is amazing. I couldn't have asked something to be better than that. But there comes the R5, which supports a 45 megapixel BSI stacked sensor, and it's just a tad bit slower than the R3's reading. It comes in at 6.7 milliseconds rather than 5 on the R3. It's not a major difference for most shooting scenarios. Unless you're shooting gold, and I don't think anybody's ever gonna see the difference between these two. To be honest, that's the part that pretty much sold me. The R5 Mark II is pretty much as fast as my R3. It is 45 megapixels rather than 24. It does 30 frames a second, just like my R3 does. The autofocus is just as good most of the time. And the smaller body pretty much sold me. Now, other than the sensors, there are a lot of other things to compare on these cameras. So let's start. The processor is the same. Canon says both support a DigiX processor, but the R5 Mark II has a newer AI chip that does autofocus calculations, and I didn't really see the difference. It's about the same in all autofocus modes, which actually is saying a lot about the R5 because the R3 is the best autofocus on the market right now. The bodies of these cameras are completely different. One is a smaller Pro body. The R5 Mark II does not have an integrated grip, it's a smaller battery. The EVF is very good in the R5 Mark II, but the R3 is a Pro level body. It has an integrated grip, the battery is insane, it has all of the vertical controls, the EVF is huge, the screen is amazing, all of the buttons are big enough, and the dials are bigger. It just is a breeze to use, and honestly, the R3 is my favorite camera to hold and use ever. In terms of the overall body, it is your preference, but for my taste, I do like the R5 Mark II body because it is so small, but I also really enjoy the R3 integrated grip because I do a lot of portraiture and it is coming in handy a lot of the time. So trade-offs on both sides, but if you want the smaller camera, I would go for the R5, honestly. Now, let's really get to the specs of this. The EVF on the R5 Mark II supports the same resolution as the R3, but in my experience, it's not as large as the R3 EVF. It's not really a big surprise for me, but the R5 Mark II's EVF is amazing, and it's better than pretty much every other camera on the market that I've tried, except for the Sony A9 III. But the R3's EVF feels a lot larger and feels a little more optical than what a standard mirrorless camera feels like today. The screens on the back seem to be about the same. Yes, I know the resolution is a little less on the R5 Mark II versus the R3, but really doesn't make any difference at all. In terms of card configuration, they are the same. One CF Express Type B card and one SD card slot. Let's talk video, because video is a subject that many of you actually want to know about. The R3 does 6K RAW, up to 60 frames a second, full frame, no crops, no whatever. No autofocus issues, no overheating, no nothing. The R3 is amazing at doing video. It also does 4K full frame up to 120 frames a second in a compressed format, not RAW. So you could choose C-Log 3 for that on the R3, and via shooting the RAW with the 6K output, you could change the gamma to C-Log 2 in DaVinci Resolve. So there's a little benefit to shooting RAW with the R3, and also you get a little more dynamic range, but that's given at shooting RAW. The footage out of the R3 is absolutely stunning. It's amongst the best I've ever used in terms of actual video coming out of the camera and the sensor. It's superb. I have nothing bad to say about it, except for one thing. I wish it had C-Log 2 in every mode, not just RAW 6K. But if you can deal with C-Log 3 and less dynamic range, and you know how to expose right, and you shoot with lights in the studios, or you are actually producing something and you have a ton of lights and a ton of production really comes into it, then it doesn't really matter, from my experience at least. Now, let's talk about the R5 Mark II's video. It does 8K up to 60 frames a second, yes, in RAW, so that's very nice. It does C-Log 2 in every mode, 42 10-bit, so nothing to worry about there. It does 4K up to 120 frames a second, again, without any limitations. It does not overheat as quickly as the R5 that came before it, but it could still overheat, and you could attach the fan grip for it, the cooling grip for it, and you would get longer recording times. It's not something that is a problem for me because I never encountered it with the R5 Mark II. Yes, I've seen the timer come up before, the overheating countdown, I guess, but I didn't get to the point that it stopped recording or that I had any problems with it. It works fine. And for me, if the camera worked for my scenarios, then I guess I can call it even, because this one does not overheat and this one does not overheat at all. So I don't really care. The image quality actually in video is a little better in the R5 compressed formats than the R3 compressed formats, up to 4K 60 frames a second. If you are going to shoot 120 frames a second a lot, then I would get the R3 because it does it a little better. It looks a little smoother, and I feel like the autofocus tracking is just a little more sticky and works better in 120 frames a second. That's just, to my eyes, I could be wrong here. Shooting video with the R3 is a lot like the C70. It is a bigger body, it feels well stabilized, and I really do like it. The eyepiece here works phenomenally well, and all of the controls are in the right place. The switch to video mode is right at your fingertip, and I do like the body for video. The R5 on the other end is a little smaller, a little more nimble, but it is a less stable platform for me. I don't know how to describe it, maybe because it's less heavy, but mostly because it's not as big as the R3. It is less stable to my usage. But then again, it's not a video camera for me. It is an hybrid, so that's fine. In terms of dynamic range and ISO capabilities in video, I did not see much of a difference in terms of the ISO performance. Yes, the R3 cleans up at different ISOs. The R5 Mark II cleans up at 4000 ISO in video, so 800 and 4000, and then it gets noisier pretty linearly. Up to 12,800, I guess it's pretty usable, but the R3 does something very different. The R3 cleans up at 800, which is base, then it cleans up again at 3200, then there is another level of cleaning at around 5000, I guess, and if I remember correctly, or 6400, and then 12,800 is a little cleaner than 10,000. ISO capabilities on the R3 are better still in video mode, but it's not such a dramatic difference between the two. In terms of dynamic range, there is actually a difference. The raw output out of both of these. If you're shooting 8K with the R5 Mark II or shooting 6K with the R3, there's a little more resolution in the R5 footage, but the 6K footage out of the R3 looks phenomenal, so I have no problems with it. In terms of dynamic range, in the raw files, not much of a difference if you are grading them the same. And in terms of ISO performance, the R3 seems to be a little better in the raw. Okay, so in terms of the actual compressed codecs on both of these cameras, I did actually see a difference. The R5 Mark II footage seems to have a little more dynamic range, but I'm pretty sure it's just down to the log curve, because the C-Log2 has about a stop more dynamic range than C-Log3, which the R3 uses. I'm pretty confident that if the R3 had C-Log2, it would perform a little better actually than the R5 Mark II footage. But it is what it is, and C-Log2 is currently a little better on the R5 Mark II, so about a stop of dynamic range difference between the two of them. So yeah, I'll put it that way. I do prefer the R5 Mark II's footage in the compressed codecs than what I was getting with the R3 in the compressed codecs. But if I'm shooting raw, I do prefer the R3 footage. The 6K is a lot more usable to my eyes than the 8K, which I have no use for. 6K is better in terms of memory space and actually editing the footage. So I guess that sums it up for the video capabilities of both. Now, let's get into image quality in photo mode, because that's what I use both of these cameras primarily for. And that's where it actually gets very interesting to my eyes, because the R5 Mark II supports a 45 megapixel sensor and the R3 is 24. I expected there to be a larger difference in ISO capabilities and a larger difference in dynamic range. But this is not the case. Dynamic range, I do see a little difference in terms of actual highlight recovery, but mostly for how I like to shoot, it does not bother me. Let's go into the ISO capabilities now. I do not go and shoot at 12,800 ISO for a living. That's not what I do. I own faster lenses, 1.2s, 1.4s. So I don't really care if the R3 does better at 8,000 ISO or 6,400 ISO. But I do care if the images look cleaner up to, let's say, 1,600 ISO or 2,500 ISO. Because that's where the majority of my images lie. Up to around 3200 ISO, that's the maximum I normally shoot. Is there such a big difference between the two? And to my eyes, there is a difference, yes. The images on the R3 are much cleaner, looking at pixel level, right? Zooming into 100, 200%, the images are cleaner. But when looking at the full picture, I couldn't see much of a difference, and I actually do like adding a little bit of grain to my images, so it does not bother me that much. Images in the R5 Mark II are pretty clean, right about to 6400 ISO, and they are very usable up to that point. If you are planning to go higher than this on a regular basis, crossing the 10,000 ISO mark or 12,800, then the R3 is a much better buy, because the images are cleaner straight out of the camera. Yeah, I was left a little shocked to not see that big of a difference between the two, and as a result of that, I do use the R5 Mark II more often than what I use my R3. Yes, I like the R3 better. It is a nicer camera to hold and use, but the R5 Mark II does pretty much everything I needed to do, and honestly, it could be my main camera. It could. Yes, it could. Yes, I would like to try the R1. Yes, I do like my R3, but honest to God, the R5 Mark II is such a good camera now that you don't really need the actual pro-level bodies. More points of difference in the bodies. The R3 is such a rugged body that I could use it in the rain, in the pouring rain. I could use it during a storm or in the desert with sand all over. It wouldn't sweat. there would be no problems. The R5 Mark II on the other end, I do not know about that. I did not try it in all of those conditions, so I don't know what to say. It does not feel as rugged as the R3. That I can tell you for sure, but only time will tell if it is actually up to the standards of this. If you want my opinion, if you get a good deal on an R3, let's say used in a new condition, then the R3 is such a good camera that I wouldn't pass it up. It's a good camera to have for around $4,000, or if you can get it a little lower than that, that's amazing. I paid around $6,000 for this, and I'm happy with the purchase. I do not regret it at all, but right now, in today's market, if I would be comparing the R5 Mark II new and the R3 new, most of the time, if I do not need a bigger battery or I do not need a rugged body like the R3, I would be fine with my R5 Mark II, and it's a good deal. It's a pro camera at a smaller body that does 99% of what the R3 can do at a high resolution. So is it a better buy? For most people, I would guess yes. If you are a pro sports shooter or a news shooter, then I guess the R3 is still a better buy because it's more rugged. It is up to the standards of all pro SLRs from Canon, the 1DX line and now the R1. Okay, so it is your choice at the end of the day, and I hope you learned something today in this episode about these two cameras and you can make a decision based on what you've learned. I hope you enjoyed this episode and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.